Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everyone, from wherever you are joining us. It's my pleasure to host this Q&A with the filmmaker and some of the cast members and some of the friends of the movie. My name is Giulio Boccaletti. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer of the Nature Conservancy, and TNC is very pleased to have partnered with Raindance on this theme, on this environmental theme that's been running through the festival for the first time. We have a lot to talk about and not a lot of time, and so I will keep it very short. I'll just say, if you are watching this and have burning questions, please make sure that you write them in the chat. There'll be a behind-the-scenes moderator that will funnel those questions to me, and I'll make sure to put them to our panelists today. So let me start by welcoming you and thank you, Manuel. Manuel is Capellin is the filmmaker, and I'll start with him. I'll avoid doing an introduction of everybody, otherwise I'll consume all the time. But congratulations on a really heartfelt and very moving picture and film. I really enjoyed watching it. I watched it with everybody else just now, and so it's fresh from viewing it. But I thought I'd start with a little bit of a provocation, Emmanuel, if you will, allow me. And it's a good natured provocation in that I like the movie, but I'll say it nevertheless. About 4 minutes in, you start with this really wonderful story yourself and how you came to this, and you say at 4 minutes in, I used to do political films that achieved nothing or very little, and then here we are watching a film that you made. And so can you talk a little bit about what is different about this and what drove you to kind of do another film on this topic?
Right. Well, a very good question. It is another political film, yet another one, and maybe it'll change nothing, but I just had to do it. You know, more and more, I think when I was 20, I wanted to save the world, and I think we don't ever really save the world. We really save ourselves, and this film for me is a way of doing that, first of all. So you have to be very humble as to what this film is going to do. But I do think there is a difference between the political films I used to cooperate in making. So I worked with Yann Arthus-Bertrand, who is a very, very famous in France, French photographer and filmmaker who did Home, Human, recently Woman. And these are films that try to engage the viewer with ideas that are political in nature, but that are quite general and are not talking about oneself. They have sort of blanket statements. And so I think this film, even though it is political in nature, it also tries to be personal. And I think this is something new in this work. I've tried to combine both and not shy away from the subjectivity of being very personal and intimate with these political questions.
And let me ask you, so it is, I mean, it does feel like a very personal movie, certainly, and it feels like we're accompanying you on a journey that brings you to sort of political action. And so how is the Emmanuel after doing this movie different from the Emmanuel that started
it? Quite different. First, I've become a father, so having a child, it changes a lot of things. No, it's really changed my life. I've never considered myself an activist. In the process of making the film, I became an activist. I'm still very engaged and active with Extinction Rebellion. Just came back from the blocking action a few days ago in Paris for the International Rebellion of the Fall. But I've also tried to embody these ideas in different parts of my life, in the way I feed myself. Of course, in the film, I say I've done this for a long time. I continue doing that. But also in the way I house myself now. So I've been working for 5 years in parallel to this film on a housing project, which we call positive energy housing. So we're producing more energy than we're consuming. And it's a housing project where we are, downsizing everything and so that we can actually be self-sufficient energy-wise. And the project is just about to come out of the ground here in the village, at the foot of the Alps, where I'm talking to you from. So these are very concrete things, but I would say personally and with this emotional journey that I try to explain in the film, I think we're never done. We always come back to step one, but when we come back on that first stage in the game, we are changed, we are different. So we come back through these same emotions, but we deal with them differently because of the journey that's already been traveled. So I would say I've grown and I'm still at step one, but it's a different step one.
Right, and I now would like to turn to Salim to get his reaction. Before I do, I just want to make sure we record the fact that you had mentioned before this session that you guys are actually still crowdfunding for the movie, right?
Right, we still have a third of the funding to find. So we have a crowdfunding campaign going on, and if you saw the film and you believe in its message, then please do support it. There is on the main page on Raindance a little link you can go to. And actually, a third of the funds go to Extinction Rebellion global support, so helping local groups in the global south also conduct actions.
So we'll come back to this. We'll remind people at the end before we close this. But let me turn to you, Salim, and then after that, I'll come to Susie. But Salim, you know, it's interesting because until you came on the screen, I was sort of worried that, you know, it was going to be a movie about a lot of people in the West who sort of suddenly discovered that there's problems with the environment, and then you should appear. And, you know, you've been around for quite some time in this. And so here you are in this movie, you're seeing the story of this, you know, younger gentleman kind of going through a process of discovering what you've been working on for a long time. And, you know, heaven knows Bangladesh has been a laboratory for adaptation, you know, since Akhtar Hamid Khan and Camilla projects and all of that.
Absolutely.
Right? So what has been your reaction in watching the story?
Well, I'm very glad I waited till this moment to watch it, Emmanuel. Thank you for inviting me. And I must also say that it was quite a contrast because during the Paris climate talks in Paris in 2015, there was another filmmaker, an Austrian documentary filmmaker called Malinowski, who was also filming me. And he produced a documentary called Guardians of the Earth, which was very much about the Paris Agreement, how it happened, it sort of over the 2 weeks of the agreement, how it evolved. But this one, I was expecting something similar, but it wasn't. It was Emmanuel's story. And I really was very taken by that, Emmanuel. And you know, even though you and I have had conversations over the years in various locations, including Paris and here in Dhaka, I really did not get the full length or breadth of your engagement and your own personal story here, and I really felt that struck me here in it hit my heart rather than my head, and I really like that. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Salim, I mean, you know, as you say, I mean, one of the results of these is that you'll probably become a global superstar on the screen.
He already is. He already is. People don't know that.
But the question remains of what is the, you know, I mean, Emmanuel had this provocation at the beginning, you know, yet another political film that may achieve nothing. Here you are, you know, a kind of an experienced negotiator, and the people that go to these negotiations all believe they're all there for the same reasons. And so what do you think, where do you think these types of personal stories fit in the journey that we're on?
I think personal stories are extremely important. And in fact, I do a series of voices from the front lines of the people that I work with, who are the most vulnerable people in the most vulnerable communities in the most vulnerable countries to the impacts of climate change. And their personal stories are extremely important to me. But that's not enough. I mean, the decisions are being made at many, many different higher levels where they cannot reach. I have the opportunity to be present in these higher level meetings. I'm not a negotiator, by the way. I don't represent any country.
Right,
I go as an observer and I advise the vulnerable country groups in the negotiations. And it's not a level playing field by any means. It's very much stacked against the vulnerable, poorer countries. But every now and again, if we get our act together and we do things right and strategically, we do win something. And the Paris Agreement, the 1.5 degree global goal, temperature goal, was a big win for us, and that we were very proud of. Now, whether it makes a difference in the real world still remains to be seen. But in the negotiating world, it made a big difference.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. We'll come back to this, and we'll come back to sort of the reality of where we are on the journey and so forth and so on. But I want to just keep on this theme of people that were in the movie reacting to the movie. And so let me ask you, Susie, next, and then I'll come to you, Richard, because in a way, your and Richard's moments are very sort of emotional, very personal representations of your own sort of experience and personal reflections. And so what was your reaction at watching yourself and watching the context that Emmanuel has put you in?
Oh man, we don't have enough time for me to tell you all that, but I'll tell you one thing that my first reaction, or one of my reactions, which was, you know, in some of my work, I focus on how do we effectively communicate climate change. And I will tell everyone, do not focus on the problem. Do not focus on the problem at the extent, you know, at the exclusion, if you will, of the solution, because it leaves people desperate and hopeless. And here we are, a movie, what, an hour and 45 minutes long, and it was essentially all talking about how deeply troubling the outlook is. And so I guess my first reaction to the movie is how emotionally demanding it is. And I actually disagree that it's just Emmanuel's story. You know, of course it is. It's very rare that a director is so directly in the movie, right? You're a protagonist at the same time that you're constructing this over 5 years or however long it went to do that. I think it's anyone's story who actually is willing to look at the facts, who's willing to look at the curves, who's willing to look at the details, and who is as deeply involved as Richard and as Salim are involved in some of these big processes, international negotiations, or in, you know, deep studies of how does the energy system actually work. So if you think about that deeply, I think you arrive at least the same despair that I saw, or that was depicted, that Emmanuel had in the beginning. It certainly is one that I've encountered. I'm hearing between the lines, if not as explicitly, the same from Richard and Salim. When Salim, you live in, and work with the people in the very environment in which you keep talking about, we can do adaptations, we do another after that one doesn't work anymore, and then another one until we come to the limit. At one point, we will come to the limit of all these things we try. And I think if you navigate that without despair, I don't know how that works. I just think this is the human journey.
Right. And yeah, and of course, there was another sort of a protagonist that filmed himself, Al Gore, 20 years ago, telling us about the sort of, the warming. And in a way, it was a journey, personal journey too, that had a kind of great arc with a very different intent and a very different background. I mean, well, I'm not suggesting you are.
Oh no, actually, it was a big influence in thinking about the film. Actually,
yeah, but it is that kind of sort of testimony, that is supposed to bring bring a perspective on this. And let me turn to you, Richard, with the same question. I mean, you've been in this space for some time, describing a version of the future that you hope people will hear. You watch this movie, you see yourself in it, with other people. What's your reaction?
Well, I thought it was masterful. I mean, and we've already talked about how personal the movie is, but I think that's important because, well, first of all, the movie gets its facts correct, which I think is really important. And it's a very informed movie when it's talking about energy, population, climate change. All of that is immaculately correct. But then the thing is, for most people, when they begin to understand these things, they come to a crossroads where they have difficulty integrating the information emotionally. They have difficulty talking to the people around them about it. And so at that crossroads, either they find some way to integrate this into their lives and their life choices, or they just decide to tune it out. And I think this is a movie for everyone who's coming to that crossroads. And I think it can be extraordinarily helpful at this moment for millions of people who are facing that.
Yeah, yeah. Let me turn to Sarah. Sarah, you weren't in the movie. You and I are the only people that weren't in the movie. I don't know if we should feel excluded here, but you are in spirit present because, of course, you represent Extinction Rebellion, which, in a way, particularly as we get towards the end of the movie, sort of is mentioned and then sort of represents the philosophy that sits behind where the movie sort of ends. And so I know that you haven't had a chance to see fully the picture, but I suppose the question is this. I mean, the movie tells a very personal journey on this particular story. Here we are, you and I sitting in the UK. Tomorrow the furlough scheme ends and people will have all sorts of concerns about the economy. COVID is happening, there's the pandemic, etc. So this sort of direct action story that starts when people's entire attention can be dominated by this issue of climate change. What happens when all these other things then happen around it? Does it really work?
So I think the one fact we have to accept is that what's happening to us with the pandemic is part of the greater ecological collapse that we're now witnessing. So we no longer have the privilege almost to deal with one emergency at a time. We are now dealing with the collapse of our life support system, and that's what the pandemic is. So that's part of it, and it's a threat multiplier. So we know that the poorest people, like with climate change, are suffering the most. So we have no choice now but to deal with the pandemic and to deal with climate change and to deal, with the storms that are going to come this winter and hit us. Like Bangladesh is having to deal with a third of its country being flooded and deal with the pandemic. And now it's going to have to deal with, I imagine, huge disruption of its food supply, so that we don't have a single crisis to deal with anymore. So given that and accepting that, to push our governments to take the necessary action and to change that system, which Richard touched on a little bit in the film, we have to take action. We have to disrupt. We have to disobey. Because if we don't, it's too easy just to carry on focus on the next immediate crisis and, to deal with the next priority. So we have to deal with everything now at once. And
let me ask you, Sarah, I mean, how... because Extinction Rebellion now has had a track record for a couple of years. It's, this push to direct action has been going on. How is it going? I mean, is it working?
So I don't know that it's going to work. I don't know that we're going to achieve what we need to achieve. I do know that the last 40 years of environmental action didn't get us where we needed to be on any scale. I mean, let's face it, our nature charities, our wildlife charities have just basically managed decline for the last 40 years. And, that's what people tell me when they're being honest and you're sitting over a cup of coffee or a beer with them. They recognise that's what they've been doing. And I think pretty much the IPCC has not managed to reduce carbon emissions. You might have managed it. They possibly might have managed that they haven't increased as much as they would have done without the IPCC, but in pretty much the same way, it's just been managing decline. So I don't know that non-violent direct action is going to work, but from what I've read, it's the only thing which provides a pathway and a route to achieving social change, because nothing else has worked on this particular topic.
Right. And so let me come back to you, Emmanuel, and let's go around a little bit further now, get into the kind of substance of the issue. And I suppose, I mean, I'm moderating here. There'd be a long conversation to be had about whether that is the only option or not. Nevertheless,
but I can read in your eyes, you have a lot of things to say about these issues. It must be very hard for you not to share them.
Well, I mean, the one thing I think we can all agree on is that this is most certainly something that where citizenship matters, where the presence of being a citizen, being present and actually taking ownership for this issue matters a great deal. One of the questions that's coming from the audience is a natural question that comes from watching, 1 hour and 40 minutes of, as Susie said, rather sort of compelling, but, somewhat distressing footage is, what do I do? what do I do next? You know, how can I help? That's the questions come in from the audience. And so here you are, you've shown this. Let's assume that millions of people show it. I hope it happens. What are you asking of them exactly? Are you asking them to do what you're doing? What's the ask here?
Well, I would say there are two answers to this. I would say I would ask them to recognize whatever little part of that journey in the film story resonates with them. You know, maybe they have traveled part of that journey. Maybe they have traveled that journey many times themselves already, and recognizing that this is affecting us psychologically, socially, I think is important. It is at a very basic level. We need to have this conversation because there are a lot of people who are actually in big distress and who are not sharing this around them because they think, well, there are so many problems with COVID, people don't have enough food on the table, and I'm just worried about the future. The present is fine for me. But it is actually a real problem. It is spreading, and it is actually the visions, the stories we tell ourselves about the future structure are present as well. And I think it's very important that we have a conversation, national, international, about these questions. You know, there are words coming out like eco-anxiety and things like that. And I think it's important. And actually in France, where we have a full theatrical release coming in on the 10th of March, we will have in the theaters moderators to help people discuss in the sitting in the room, in the theater house, talking to each other about these questions, because we think we really need to accompany this film because it is quite a heavy load. Now, on a more practical level, my second answer is that I'm actually inspired by the work of Joanna Macy, who is an eco-psychologist and an American activist and Buddhist scholar who has written for many years about what do we do, what type of action makes sense in this kind of giant crumbling around us. And it was actually through my hope to have Joanna Macy be part of the film that I met Suzanne. So this is how Suzanne became part of the story. And actually her thinking really is present throughout the film, because she says there are basically a society that would be more supportive of a thriving world would need to sit on a stool with 3 feet, and each feet are very important. The first one is a change of consciousness, just the way we understand things, and it can be a very scientific look at things, because when you go push science very far, it actually becomes very, very metaphysical. I think this is a big part of the story. So what can I do? Well, helping people understand what is happening to us collectively. And that's one of the main motives or reasons for me is I really want to avoid us turning to the wrong. There are going to be a lot of angry people, a lot of scared and angry people who are going to be looking for reasons of why all of this is happening to us. And we're seeing this happening even with the COVID. I mean, all kinds of conspiracy theories and things like this. And we need to put a lot of light and a lot of knowledge around these issues. It's really important. So change of consciousness is number one. Second thing is offering alternatives. And in the film, my personal alternative is going back to the local when the global is no longer possible, not because we don't want it or like it, but just because it physically will not be able to thrive without an abundant, cheap energy to fuel it, to propel it. So coming back to the local and reconstructing bonds that are local with regards to our social bonds, our food bonds, our energy bonds, all of these things that support us. That's the alternatives. And the third thing is being willing to engage in the struggle and to draw red lines and say, this shall not happen anymore. These processes that stabilize our climate, that purify our water, are essential to a thriving society. And I am going to stop the destruction of these processes by putting my body on the line. And so at the end, we see Extinction Rebellion kind of like the tip of the iceberg at the end, because it's very out there. But actually, the three ways of engaging with change are important. So I would say to the viewers or to anybody who is asking that question for themselves is, you really have to see what you're best at and what you're going towards naturally. You know, if you want to work on a change of consciousness and knowledge and pushing that knowledge forward, or in sharing it, or if it's opposing destruction, or it's offering alternatives. And if you want to do all three, great. That's what I've been trying to do in the film.
Yeah, thanks for that. So let me turn to you, Susie, because there's a question in the chat from Gianluca, who asks why, and let me just go back to it, and actually we should probably not answer in the chat or we'll create double parallel conversations. But Gianluca asks, why do scientists still today disagree on the severity of climate change and its impact on the planet? Susie, do they really still disagree?
I don't believe so. The consensus science is very clear that climate change is happening, that it is human caused, and that, you know, without changing the trajectories that we're currently on, we will cause enormous suffering. What science is not very good at yet is to, well, a couple of things. One is to get at the complexity of all the interacting changes that are happening, both in the climate system itself, but also with the rest of the Earth systems. So that makes just capturing these complex dynamics really, really challenging. The other thing it's not very good at is to say exactly, you know, which Tuesday in which months in which year, you know, some flood is going to occur. It's not that precise, right? It's simply not able to do that. It can tell us patterns, and those, you know, are depicted, right? We're going to see more extreme events, more fires, more floods, more, you know, the sea level is going to rise on an exponential curve. So we actually are fairly clear about, you know, the general trends and how significant they will be. I mean, just, you know, I'll sort of pick on one example that comes or speaks directly to the situation depicted with Salim, right? We're heard basically of sea level rise in Bangladesh, which, you know, over the last century maybe was, I don't know, a foot at most, or not even quite. And we're expecting 6 times that at least over 100 years. Is unprecedented in human history. And so, you know, whether or not and how our communities and governments and societies at any level will deal with that demand, with that level of challenge. It's not just going to be, you know, one household at a time. I mean, we're going to have to relocate every coastal community around the planet, probably the biggest construction project that humanity has ever undertaken. The Great Wall of China will look like a toy if we have to do that. So, you know, we actually know quite a bit. We just don't know exactly where, when, what in the specifics that are sufficient for us to make decisions to build that into our standards and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But the
let me build on this question, because another question came in, and I'll turn to you, Richard, to contemplate this before I come back to you, Salim. So Richard, one of the questions here is, the more you think about this issue, do you feel that there is in fact a shift in people's sensitivity towards the environmental crisis, and this particular environmental crisis in particular? Richard, you've been, again, you know, you've been following this for a while. Do you feel the tide turning?
Yes, I think there's much more awareness, particularly of climate change. I think that climate change has become such an overwhelming concern that it, in some ways, has taken attention away from loss of biodiversity, plastic pollution, and all the other ways that we're reducing the planet's viability for human occupancy. But I would also say, that this awareness has tended to focus for perfectly good reasons on public policy. You know, what governments can do to, you know, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to promote alternative energy sources, and so on. And I think for many people, this sort of takes away their own agency. They're waiting for government to either solve the problem or not solve the problem, but for themselves, well, there's nothing I can do. And that's really not the case. You know, even if government actually does the right thing and puts in the regulations on greenhouse gas emissions and and finds ways to promote renewable energy more and do all of these things. The reality is that daily life for the average person is going to change pretty dramatically as a result. So it would be really helpful to know what's the direction of those changes, and can I start doing that now?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people would actually be this, and I'm talking mostly about people in the wealthy industrialized countries now, because they're the ones whose lifestyle, so to speak, is going to have to change the most. I think we have to be honest about this, and also find ways to begin to make those changes together and publicly and honestly, in ways that, you know, promote our enjoyment of life, the beauty of life, because that's entirely possible. Right. And so it's not just a matter of waiting for the government to do the right thing.
Can I build on this point, Salim, to bring you back into the picture? Because at one point in the movie, you make this point that people in Bangladesh today are feeling what then the rest of the world will feel tomorrow. I think those are the words you use, or something along those lines. And there is this question, of course, of where, as people in the developed world and the richer parts of the world start awakening to this problem, the fact of the matter is that there are vulnerable people today that we know how to help and that we probably should. Right. So is there a tension there between kind of this awakening that happens in, let's say, California, or let's say the south of France, or let's say whatever, whilst, you know, Cox's Bazar has 1 million Rohingyas sitting in Bangladesh today. Absolutely. Who are vulnerable people with, you know, essentially using fuel wood to warm themselves. Right. I mean, that's a solvable problem today. And if there is outrage, it should be directed towards solving that rather than just focusing at home and domestic issues. No. So how do you think about the tension between, you know, poverty alleviation, fundamentally development, and this broader global climate issue? And I know they're connected, but in the end, if you have to choose, how do you resolve that tension?
Well, I feel very strongly that the climate change issue is a global issue in which every single one of us are primarily citizens of planet Earth and need to think of ourselves as that, and only secondarily, way down the list, citizens of the UK or France or wherever, the US. And we are really connected. The COVID-19 showed that, climate change is showing that, biodiversity loss is showing that, and we need to be doing these things together. And so, you know, we in Bangladesh are actually adapting to the impacts of climate change quite well. You know, 1 million Rohingyas came over the border from Myanmar 2 years ago. When that happened, it was the biggest refugee crisis in the world. It isn't anymore. We are looking after them. We're feeding them. We're giving them medical assistance. We are looking after them in Bangladesh, which is already one of the most overcrowded countries in the whole world. So we can cope. The question is, can the whole world cope? That was the point I made in one of the interviews. And from that perspective, we have failed. The global governments have failed to take action, and I agree with Sarah. So to me, you are our spearhead. The Extinction Rebellion and young people all over the world, particularly in the developed countries, are the ones that we look to solve the problem. And the problem is reduce your own emissions. So you don't have to come give me a helping hand, but do the work at your own country, in your own. Is when, you know, Jane Fonda went to Vietnam to express solidarity to the North Vietnamese. They said, go home and stop bombing us. That's the message. Stop bombing us. You are bombing us.
Yeah, eloquently said. So, guys, we are getting to the end of the time that we have, and what I'd like to do, there was a provocative question asked by Joanna, who says, we keep asking governments and businesses to fix the problem when they are and have been the addicts of unsustainable growth, to be provocative, she says in parentheses. And there's the question. I'd like us to end on this question. So what I'll do is I'll start with you, Sarah, and then I'll work my way back towards Emmanuel, who will have the last word here. And the question is simple. Do we believe we can solve the climate crisis? Now, bear in mind that we did watch 1.5 hours of sort of pretty, compelling, but heart-wrenching footage. So can we solve the climate crisis? Sarah, and then I'll go to Richard. Sarah?
We can solve the climate crisis. Well, actually, we probably cannot solve the climate crisis. We are going to suffer, even if we stopped emissions tomorrow, we are going to suffer the impacts of a changing climate. So whatever we do, life is going to change. Can we reduce the impacts of that? Yes, we can. We know how to do that. Can we do that while sustaining economic growth and the capitalist system? No, we can't. We need degrowth, we need contraction of the affluent economies and convergence with the developing world to do it. And that's why it's not going to be done by personal action alone. It's got to be done by citizens coming together and demanding system change.
Yeah, very good. Richard, same question. Can we solve the climate crisis? And then I'll come to Susie. Richard? Oh, you're on mute, I think. Either accident.
Sorry. Similar thoughts. I mean, when most people, when they think about solving the climate crisis, assume that that means, well, we can make a few technical changes. You know, we just chose the wrong energy sources and we'll replace those with different energy sources. And then we'll continue living pretty much the way we are now. We'll all be driving cars. We'll all, you know, live in big cities and push a button and order something from Amazon, and it'll all be basically the same. We have created an industrial way of life that is overrunning natural limits in more than a dozen different fundamental ways. So getting back to living within those limits is going to mean changing a tremendous amount about what we think of as normal life. So, you know, most people would not see that as a solution to the problem. They would see that as a problem in itself. The enormity of the adaptation that's actually required.
Well, you pointed to the fundamental choices that we have in front of us, right?
Yeah.
And so same question to you, Susie. I'm accelerating us just because of the time, but Susie, can we solve the climate crisis? And then I'll come to you, Salim. Susie, can we solve the climate crisis?
So for me, the answer is reminiscent of what Cornel West, the African-American philosopher, said about hope. He said, optimism is when you have good evidence that you're going to achieve the outcome you want. Hope is when you have good reason to worry or good reason to doubt that you will. So I am not optimistic that we will solve the crisis, but I am hopeful that we will.
Thank you. Well put. Salim, over to you.
Sure.
Do we believe we can solve the climate crisis? And then I'll come back to Emmanuel. Salim.
Sure. So very quickly, let me just say that there is some good news, and I mentioned it earlier in the Paris Agreement. We have agreed to keep the temperature below 1.5. As I said, that was a huge effort from our side. We are nowhere near meeting that target. We are headed for well over 2 degrees, possibly 3 degrees. But we can meet 1.5 degrees if everybody does the actions that they promised to do. And we need to make them do that. We either make our leaders listen and do it, or change our leaders and get ones that will do it. And that really is where we have to put our action.
Very good. Thanks, Salim. So we come back to you, Emmanuel. So you've done this work, you've filmed this film years after you said the films didn't make a difference, but now you have made a film and it does engender a powerful debate. Can we solve the climate crisis? What's your conclusion out of your years of working on this film?
Well, I don't think it's a crisis. I think it's a much longer term problem. So I don't think crisis is even the right word. But our new climate norm is, I think, going to continue unfolding, and it will be, like Sarah said earlier, better or worse depending on how good we are at fostering collective action. So I think we definitely have, and that is why I'm very engaged with Extinction Rebellion. We definitely have some way of changing the curve, but the curve will still be there. And so we will have drastic changes in our lifestyle. And so for me, really, when we say solving, it's how do we adapt, and who is we? Can we still talk about humanity as a we when we're being so unequal between countries and within countries? And so for me, this is an answer I've been answering to at a lot of Q&As after the premieres in France. Is I quote somebody anonymous who is a Yellow Jacket, the Yellow Jacket movement in France, who was on social media, who wrote something that I think is very powerful, and I'll say it in a second. But basically, and I think we need to recognize this, and you said it earlier, we have a problem because you have a bunch of people who are trying to save the social rights that we have gained over the 20th century with our lifestyles and all the rights that go with that, mobility, all the personal liberties. And these people want just things to be better shared. They see people who have a very big pie of the big piece of the pie, and they just want more equality. But they don't think that the economic pie is a problem in of itself, and they don't think that it's going to have to shrink. Then we have the Greens who say, well, no, the pie is too big. It actually needs to shrink. And these are two worlds. They're not they want to talk to each other and be friends, but really they're two different discourses. And I think this man, this yellow jacket, wrote something that is going to be the future convergence of these two things. And he said, okay, all right, I'm fine with crumbs, but crumbs for everyone. And this is, I think, something we're not ready to live yet. We're far from that. But I think the day we will have a convergence of the social movements saying we need more equality and sharing the resources, and some people saying actually we need degrowth, this is where we'll be at. This is with the convergence. So I think actually it's a very positive and hopeful vision, and it's the only thing that I think is realistic given the limits of our world. And it's going to ask for, I mean, these are little words I throw out at the end of the film, but there are whole worlds that we need to work on. Is what is going to be the social contract of the future? And is it going to be only a French social contract by Rousseau, or is it going to be a world social contract where we actually have that conversation at an international level? And I think this actually is a very hopeful conversation that's actually becoming relevant once again, because we are starting to see really the limits of our development.
Well, it is extraordinary how many of these conversations end up in sort of utopianism of the 19th century, it turns out.
But actually, we actually have to be very realistic. You know, the social contract is going to have to, I mean, reconsider everything. You know, what do I have the right to as an individual? It's going to be, that's going to be the conversation.
Very good. So we've run out of time. I do want to give you, Emmanuel, the last word to tell us what's next for this movie and what's next for you.
Well, first I want to thank Salim, Susie, Richard, Sarah for being here, and my thoughts go out to Jean-Marc and Pablo, who couldn't be with us, who are also protagonists in the film. They have each given me enormous amount of time, but I think more importantly, an enormous amount of trust, because they had no idea what I was going to do with their image, their thoughts. So really, it's a very important moment for me. I want to say this, so many years, I mean, it's 8 years in the making, this film. And finally, we're there. It's ready to come out into the world. It's doing really well in the festivals. Actually, this morning, we heard we have received our 4th prize. We received the Audience Award by the festival in Madrid, where it was showing 2 days ago. So that's another really good news for the film. And I hope, like Richard, that the film will actually help people get moving, but not just externally, also internally, and hold that tension, like you were saying earlier, between the internal struggle and the external struggle, and that in some way can help us look, not turn to scapegoats, but to find our own responsibility in all of this. And yeah, so my last word is just a huge thank you to everyone who made this film possible. There are a lot of people behind this, and thank you to the Raindance Film Festival for organizing this talk and allowing us to have this mini celebration. It's a very, very nice moment for me.
Yeah, and of course, you should remind people not to forget that you're still fundraising and crowdfunding for.
Yes, thank you for having a head on your shoulders. Yes,
and we'll still find the address on the website.
Yeah, so if you go on the Raindance website, you will see a red link on the film's page where you can go and help the film by donating. That will be very helpful, because we still are running after the budget.
Very good. Well, we've this was far too short, and we didn't have obviously enough time to do justice to the topic. But Richard, Sarah, Susie, and Salim, thank you so much for taking part. And Emmanuel, congratulations on a really heartfelt and very compelling movie, and best of luck on the next steps. All right,
we're for moderating.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much. All the
Thank you
best.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.